Have you ever witnessed a moment when respect collides with ignorance so violently that it changes everyone present forever? The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds at Camp Redford, casting muted shadows across the parade ground where Marines gathered for what would become an unforgettable Memorial Day ceremony. Frost clung stubbornly to the grass despite the late spring warmth, and the air carried that distinctive military base scent. A mixture of diesel fuel, fresh paint, and decades of tradition soaked into every building. If you've ever felt your blood boil watching someone disrespect a hero, hit that like button, because what you're about to hear will restore your faith in justice. Among the assembled crowd, one figure stood apart from the crisp uniforms and polished boots surrounding him. Edward McAlister moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had absorbed more punishment than most could endure. At 73, his weathered hands told stories of jungle warfare, and his eyes held depths that spoke of battles fought in places most Americans preferred to forget. Ed wore a faded olive-green jacket that had seen better decades. The fabric showed its age, but the metals adorning his chest gleamed with meticulous care. A silver star catching the weak sunlight, a bronze star positioned with military precision, and the unmistakable purple ribbon of a Purple Heart. Each decoration represented moments when death had reached for him, and missed by inches. The contrast between Ed's quiet dignity and the boisterous energy of the young Marines couldn't have been starker. Fresh from boot camp, these 20-somethings carried themselves with the invincible swagger that only comes before life teaches its hardest lessons. Their uniforms were immaculate, their confidence boundless, and their understanding of sacrifice limited. Drop a comment below if you think younger generations should automatically respect their elders, because these Marines were about to learn that lesson the hard way. "Check out the old-timer," whispered Lance Corporal Jake Morrison to his buddy, nodding toward Ed. "Looks like he raided a costume shop for those decorations." His companion, Private First Class Danny Chen, snickered. "Probably bought them at a surplus store. Half these old guys make up war stories to feel important." Their voices carried just enough for Ed to hear, though he gave no indication of it. His expression remained neutral, his posture straight despite the arthritis that made every movement a small victory. He'd learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, at least not with words. More young Marines joined the cruel chorus. "Hey, Grandpa," called out another, "did you get lost on your way to the VFW hall?" The laughter that followed was sharp and cutting, the kind that reveals character more than any formal evaluation ever could. These Marines, trained to honor courage and sacrifice, were mocking both without realizing it. They saw an old man in an outdated jacket, not a warrior who'd carried wounded comrades through hostile territory while bullets shredded the jungle around him. Ed's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His fingers, scarred from shrapnel that had torn through his hands during a firefight near Da Nang, remained steady at his sides. The young Marine's words stung, but not because they were unexpected. He'd endured worse than mockery. He'd survived a war that had tried to break his spirit, and a homecoming that had nearly succeeded. Share this story if you believe every hero deserves recognition, no matter how long it takes. What these Marines didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that their casual cruelty was about to collide with a force that would reshape their understanding of honor forever. Because walking across that same parade ground, his 4 stars gleaming in the morning light, was a man who knew exactly who Edward McAlister was and what he'd sacrificed for his country. The stage was set for a reckoning that would echo through Camp Redford for years to come. The weight of those mocking words transported Ed back through decades, back to a humid jungle where the air hung thick with moisture and danger. In his mind, he was 22 again, sweat streaming down his face as he crouched behind a fallen mahogany tree, radio crackling with urgent voices. The year was 1968, and Sergeant Edward McAlister was leading Alpha Squad through the dense foliage of the Mekong Delta, where every shadow could conceal an enemy, and every step forward demanded courage that most men never knew they possessed. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. The sharp crack of AK-47 fire cutting through the morning mist, the desperate shouts of his men calling for orders, the metallic taste of fear mixed with determination on his tongue. Ed remembered how his hands had remained steady even as chaos erupted around him, how he directed his squad with calm precision while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. "Martinez, take cover behind that boulder. Thompson, lay down suppressing fire on the ridge." His voice had carried authority beyond his years, forged in the crucible of combat where hesitation meant death. The silver star hanging on his faded jacket represented that day, the day he'd charged an enemy machine gun nest that had his squad pinned down for 3 grueling hours. Ed's weathered fingers unconsciously traced the outline of the bronze star as he recalled another moment that haunted his dreams. Private Danny Kowalski, barely 19, had stepped on a concealed mine during a routine patrol. The explosion had shattered the boy's leg and left him screaming in agony, while enemy fire kept the medics at bay. Without hesitation, Ed had crawled through 60 yards of open ground under heavy fire, dragging the wounded soldier to safety, while shrapnel tore through his own shoulder. The Purple Heart represented wounds both seen and hidden, the jagged scar that ran from his collarbone to his elbow, but more profoundly, the invisible injuries that time never fully healed. Ed remembered the faces of 17 men under his command who never made it home, their names etched permanently in his memory like sacred text. Each night in that steaming jungle, he'd written letters to their families, searching for words to explain how their sons had died with honor in a war that seemed to make less sense with each passing day. The sounds of that distant conflict still echoed in Ed's ears. The rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors cutting through monsoon rain, the whispered prayers of young soldiers before dawn patrols, the heartbreaking silence that followed firefights when they counted their losses. He remembered how his squad had become his family, bound together by shared hardship and mutual dependence. They'd shared their last cigarettes, their deepest fears, and their hopes for home during long nights when sleep proved elusive. Those bonds forged in combat had sustained him through the darkest moments. When Corporal James "Rabbit" Henderson took a sniper's bullet to the chest, Ed had held him as life ebbed away, promising to tell Rabbit's wife that her husband's final words were her name. When they'd been surrounded for 2 days without resupply, eating cold rations and drinking muddy water, Ed had kept morale alive with stories of the fishing trips they'd take when they got back to the world. But returning home had brought its own battles. The country that had sent them to fight seemed to have little interest in welcoming them back. Protesters spat at soldiers in airports, politicians distanced themselves from the conflict, and the very word Vietnam became associated with failure rather than sacrifice. Ed learned to keep his service quiet, to tuck his medals away, to let his haircut fade into civilian normalcy. For decades, he'd carried these memories alone. The nightmares that jolted him awake in cold sweats, the way his heart raced at the sound of backfiring cars, the profound loneliness of being surrounded by people who could never understand what he'd seen and done. His marriage hadn't survived the war's aftermath. How could he explain to his wife why he sometimes woke up reaching for a rifle that wasn't there? The counseling sessions at the VA hospital had helped some, connecting him with other soldiers who shared similar scars. They'd formed their own quiet brotherhood of survivors, men who understood without words being spoken. They met monthly at a diner downtown, sharing coffee and stories that civilian friends could never fully comprehend. Now standing on this parade ground, while young Marines questioned his relevance, Ed felt the full weight of those years pressing down on his shoulders. The medals on his jacket weren't just decorations. They were tombstones for friends who'd never aged beyond 20, testament to moments when ordinary men had risen to extraordinary acts of valor. The mocking laughter around him faded as Ed's thoughts returned to Danny Kowalski, to Rabbit Henderson, to all the boys who'd trusted him to bring them home alive. He'd done his best, saved who he could, honored the rest through a lifetime of quiet service. These young Marines before him had never faced an enemy determined to kill them, never held a dying friend, never wondered if their next step might be their last. Ed straightened his shoulders, feeling the old wounds protest but ignoring the pain. He'd earned the right to stand here, earned it with blood and sacrifice these boys couldn't begin to comprehend. The morning drill formation buzzed with restless energy as clusters of young Marines shifted in their ranks, their conversations drifting across the parade ground like smoke from distant fires. Lance Corporal Jake Rodriguez adjusted his cover with practiced nonchalance, his eyes scanning the assembled crowd before settling on the solitary figure of Ed McAlister standing quietly near the memorial wall. "Check out the museum piece over there," Rodriguez muttered to his buddy, Private First Class Tyler Brooks, nodding toward Ed's metal-adorned jacket. "Dude's wearing half the Army surplus store on his chest." Brooks snorted, his voice carrying farther than intended. "Those old-timers love their participation trophies, don't they? My grandfather's got a whole box of them collecting dust in his attic." The comment drew chuckles from the Marines within earshot, young faces lighting up with the cruel humor that often accompanies ignorance. Corporal Marcus Johnson, barely 21 himself, leaned closer to the group. "Guy probably bought those at a flea market. I mean, who even knows what half those ribbons mean anymore?" "Vietnam was like, what, 50 years ago?" added Private Tommy Chen, his voice dripping with dismissive certainty. "That whole thing was a mess anyway. At least we know how to finish what we start." The laughter spread through their ranks like ripples on a pond, each joke emboldening the next. Yet beneath their bravado lay something more complex than simple cruelty, a desperate need to establish their own relevance in a world that seemed obsessed with honoring the past. These young warriors had trained for conflicts that might never come, prepared for battles that existed more in simulation than reality. The old man's silent dignity represented everything they feared becoming. Forgotten, irrelevant, reduced to wearing faded memories of glory days. Rodriguez kicked at a pebble on the asphalt, his confidence wavering slightly as he caught sight of Ed's weathered hands. "Look at him just standing there all quiet and weird. Why doesn't he hang out with people his own age instead of lurking around our ceremonies? Maybe he's hoping someone will ask about his war stories." Brooks suggested with mock enthusiasm. "I bet he's got a whole speech prepared about how tough things were back in his day." The drill sergeant's whistle cut through their chatter like a blade, its sharp blast echoing off the surrounding buildings. The sound commanded instant silence, but the undercurrent of tension remained, crackling between the generations like electricity before a storm. Private First Class Ashley Martinez, one of the few who had remained quiet during the exchange, found herself studying Ed's posture more carefully. Something in his bearing reminded her of her own uncle, who'd returned from Afghanistan with shadows in his eyes and stories he never shared. She noticed how Ed's shoulders stayed square despite his age, how his gaze remained steady even as whispers swirled around him. "Maybe we should just leave the old guy alone," she said quietly, but her words were lost in the shuffle as the formation began to align. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the parade ground, while a slight breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant kitchen smoke. The contrast between the peaceful setting and the building tension created an atmosphere thick with anticipation, though none of the young Marines could have predicted what was about to unfold. Corporal Johnson continued his commentary, his voice lower now but no less cutting. "I heard these Vietnam guys used to come home and get spat on by protesters. Maybe that's what made them all weird and bitter." "At least people cared enough to protest," Rodriguez replied. "Now nobody even thinks about what we do unless something goes wrong. We're invisible until we mess up." Their words revealed the deeper frustration driving their behavior, the sense that their own service lacked the weight of history, that they were somehow less significant than the generation that had fought in jungles half a world away. Ed's presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of their own uncertainty about their place in military tradition. The formation continued to take shape around them, hundreds of Marines moving with practiced precision while the morning light grew stronger. Equipment clanked softly as soldiers adjusted their gear, boots scraped against concrete, and distant commands echoed from other training areas across the base. Yet through it all, Ed remained motionless, his silence more powerful than any response he might have offered to their taunts. The young Marines' laughter had grown forced, their jokes less frequent as something indefinable began to shift in the atmosphere around them. None of them noticed the approaching figure of General Hawthorne until his shadow fell across their ranks like judgment itself. The first sign of change came not as thunder, but as whisper. The subtle shift in posture among the senior non-commissioned officers who had been observing the morning formation from the periphery. Their conversations ceased mid-sentence, shoulders straightening with automatic precision as a figure emerged from the command building across the parade ground. General Frederick Hawthorne moved with the measured cadence of a man who had spent 4 decades earning every star on his collar. His uniform bore the crisp perfection expected of his rank, yet it was his bearing rather than his decorations that commanded immediate attention. At 63, the general possessed the kind of presence that didn't demand respect. It simply received it, as naturally as gravity pulls objects earthward. His steel-gray hair, trimmed to regulation length, caught the morning light as he paused at the top of the concrete steps leading down to the parade ground. From this vantage point, his keen eyes surveyed the scene before him with the thoroughness of a commander who had learned to read situations like topographical maps. Those eyes, weathered by years of difficult decisions and harder truths, missed nothing. The young Marines' laughter died gradually as word of the general's presence rippled through their ranks like a stone dropped in still water. Lance Corporal Rodriguez felt his spine straighten involuntarily, while Private Brooks suddenly found his boots fascinating enough to merit intense scrutiny. The casual disrespect that had flavored their conversation moments earlier evaporated under the weight of military hierarchy and tradition. General Hawthorne's gaze moved methodically across the formation before settling on the lone figure standing near the memorial wall. His expression, unreadable from a distance, seemed to soften almost imperceptibly as he studied Ed McAlister's patient stance. The general's own chest bore ribbons from conflicts spanning 3 decades: Desert Storm, Afghanistan, Iraq, each campaign adding lines to his face and depth to his understanding of what service truly cost. The morning breeze picked up slightly, rustling the flags mounted along the parade ground's perimeter. The sharp snap of fabric against metal poles provided a rhythmic counterpoint to the general's deliberate footsteps as he began his descent toward the formation. Each stride carried purpose, each movement calculated to project both authority and accessibility. Sergeant Major Williams, the base's senior enlisted leader, moved to intercept the general's path, ready to provide the customary briefing on the morning's activities. But General Hawthorne raised a single hand in polite dismissal, his attention focused entirely on the elderly figure standing alone among the younger Marines. The crowd's energy shifted palpably as the general's intent became clear. Conversations dropped to whispers, then ceased altogether. The irreverent commentary that had characterized the morning dissolved into uncomfortable silence as hundreds of Marines watched their commanding officer approach the man they had been mocking moments earlier. General Hawthorne's reputation preceded him, a soldier's soldier who had risen through the ranks on merit rather than politics, known for his fairness, his tactical brilliance, and his unwavering commitment to the Corps' values. His presence here, walking directly toward Ed McAlister with obvious purpose, transformed the entire atmosphere of the gathering. The young Marines, who had been so confident in their dismissal of the old soldier, now found themselves witnesses to something they couldn't yet comprehend. Something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about honor, respect, and the true meaning of military service. Time seemed to crystallize as General Hawthorne approached Ed McAlister with measured steps that echoed across the suddenly silent parade ground. The morning air hung still, as if the entire base held its breath in anticipation of something momentous. Every eye tracked the general's movement, every ear strained to catch the subtle sounds of his approach. The soft scrape of polished leather against concrete, the gentle rustle of starched fabric, the distant call of a mockingbird perched somewhere beyond the formation. Ed remained motionless, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, unaware that his quiet dignity had drawn the attention of the base's most senior officer. His gaze stayed fixed on the memorial wall before him, reading names etched in black granite. Names of men who had never made it home from jungles and deserts, mountains and valleys, where freedom demanded its price in blood and sacrifice. The general stopped precisely 3 feet away, his presence commanding yet respectful. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, neither man moved. General Hawthorne's eyes took in every detail of Ed's appearance. The carefully maintained posture despite advancing years, the faded jacket bearing ribbons that told stories of courage beyond imagination, the quiet strength radiating from shoulders that had carried burdens most men could never comprehend. Without warning or fanfare, General Hawthorne's right hand began its deliberate ascent. The movement was neither hurried nor casual. It possessed the ceremonial weight of military tradition refined across centuries of honor and sacrifice. His fingers, steady despite decades of command stress, traced their practiced path upward until they reached the precise angle demanded by protocol and respect. The salute, when it came, was flawless. General Hawthorne's hand held firm at his temple, his bearing straight and proud, his eyes locked on Ed's profile with unwavering intensity. The gesture contained volumes of unspoken communication, recognition of shared brotherhood, acknowledgement of sacrifices made in distant places, and profound respect for a warrior whose service had shaped the very foundation upon which their corps stood. The silence that followed was complete and profound. Even the mockingbird had ceased its morning song, as if nature itself recognized the solemnity of the moment. Hundreds of Marines stood frozen in place, witnessing something that transcended mere military courtesy and entered the realm of sacred ritual. Ed turned slowly, his eyes widening as he registered the 4 stars gleaming on General Hawthorne's collar, the perfect execution of the salute being rendered in his honor. For decades, he had grown accustomed to invisibility, to being overlooked or dismissed by a society that had moved beyond the conflicts of his youth. Now, before an assembly of the Corps' finest, he was being honored by one of its most distinguished leaders. The transformation in Ed's bearing was instantaneous yet subtle. His shoulders squared with renewed pride, his chin lifted with quiet dignity, and his right hand rose in automatic response. A return salute executed with the precision of muscle memory honed in countless ceremonies decades past. Though his movements showed the stiffness of age, they carried the unmistakable authority of a man who had earned the right to stand among warriors. The exchange lasted perhaps 10 seconds in real time, yet its impact rippled through the gathered formation like seismic waves. Lance Corporal Rodriguez felt his throat tighten as he watched the tableau unfold, his earlier mockery dissolving into something approaching shame. The medals on Ed's jacket no longer appeared as relics of forgotten conflicts. They emerged as badges of honor earned through trials these young Marines could barely fathom. Private Brooks found his hands trembling slightly as he witnessed the general's continued salute, held with the patience of a man who understood that some gestures required time to convey their full meaning. The casual dismissal he had shown earlier felt suddenly childish, replaced by a growing awareness that he was witnessing something far more significant than military protocol. Throughout the formation, similar transformations occurred as the reality of the moment settled into hearts and minds previously closed to such possibilities. The young Marines who had questioned Ed's relevance now found themselves confronting their own ignorance, their own failure to recognize the depth of sacrifice represented by his quiet presence among them. When both men finally lowered their hands, the spell remained unbroken. General Hawthorne stepped forward, extending his hand in greeting, and Ed accepted it with the firm grip of a man whose strength had been tested in crucibles few would ever face. No words passed between them in that moment. None were necessary. The language of mutual respect transcended speech, communicating truths that decades of explanation could never adequately convey. The spell cast by General Hawthorne's salute lingered long after both men had lowered their hands, its effects rippling through the assembled Marines like concentric circles spreading across still water. The formation remained at attention, but beneath the surface of military discipline, profound changes were already taking root in hearts and minds that had been closed to such possibilities mere minutes earlier. Lance Corporal Rodriguez stood motionless in his rank, his earlier confidence crumbling like sand castles before an incoming tide. The weight of his previous comments pressed down on his shoulders with increasing heaviness as he replayed each mocking word in his mind. His grandfather had served in Korea, returning home with stories that Rodriguez had dismissed as old man's ramblings about a forgotten war. Now, watching Ed McAlister stand with renewed dignity beside the commanding general, Rodriguez felt the sharp sting of recognition. His grandfather had possessed that same quiet strength, that same understated pride in service rendered. The young Marine's hands clenched involuntarily at his sides as shame washed over him in waves. How many times had he rolled his eyes when his grandfather spoke of frozen hills and desperate battles? How often had he changed the subject when the old man's eyes grew distant with memory? The metals gathering dust in his family's attic suddenly took on new meaning, each ribbon representing moments of courage that Rodriguez had never bothered to understand. Private Brooks experienced his own reckoning as he watched the general engage Ed in quiet conversation. The easy dismissal he had shown earlier now felt like a betrayal of everything the Marine Corps claimed to represent. His drill instructors had hammered home the importance of honoring those who came before. Yet, he had failed to recognize that principle when confronted with its living embodiment. Brooks remembered his first day at boot camp, when Gunnery Sergeant Martinez had spoken about the unbroken chain of Marine tradition stretching back through generations of warriors. "You don't wear that uniform for yourselves," the gunny had growled. "You wear it for every Marine who bled to earn your right to call yourself one of us." The words, which had seemed like typical drill instructor rhetoric at the time, now carried profound weight. Corporal Johnson found himself studying Ed's weathered features with new eyes, seeing past the lines and gray hair to the young soldier who had once faced enemies determined to kill him. The Purple Heart on Ed's jacket spoke of wounds received in service to his country, wounds that had probably saved the lives of men under his command. Johnson's own father had deployed twice to Iraq, returning both times with nightmares he never discussed, and a 1,000-yard stare that appeared without warning. The parallel struck Johnson like a physical blow. His father bore invisible scars from his own war, scars that Johnson had never bothered to acknowledge or understand. He had grown up viewing his father's distant moments as weakness rather than recognizing them as the cost of strength expended in defense of others. Private Martinez, who had remained largely silent during the earlier mockery, felt vindication mixed with sadness as she observed her squadmate's transformation. Her uncle's service in Afghanistan had taught her family to recognize the signs of sacrifice, the way soldiers carried themselves, the shadows that sometimes passed behind their eyes, the careful way they spoke about certain subjects. She had seen those same qualities in Ed from the beginning, but her voice had been drowned out by the chorus of ridicule. Now, as whispered conversations began to spread through the ranks, Martinez heard a different tone emerging. The crude jokes and dismissive comments gave way to questions that revealed growing awareness. "Do you think he really earned all those medals?" one Marine asked quietly. "What do you suppose he went through over there?" wondered another. The questions themselves represented progress, curiosity replacing contempt, interest supplanting indifference. The young Marines were beginning to confront the uncomfortable reality that their earlier behavior had revealed more about their own ignorance than about Ed's worth. Private Chen, who had so casually dismissed the Vietnam conflict as ancient history, found himself remembering stories his own grandfather had shared about fleeing China during the Communist Revolution. His family had found refuge in America, building new lives in a country that offered freedom his ancestors had never known. The connection between his family's gratitude and Ed's service crystallized in his mind with startling clarity. The transformation occurring within the formation was not dramatic or sudden. It unfolded gradually, like dawn breaking over distant mountains. But it was real and profound, changing not just how these young Marines viewed one elderly soldier, but how they understood their own place in the continuum of service and sacrifice that defined their chosen profession. As the morning ceremony drew to a close and the formation began to disperse, Ed McAlister remained standing near the memorial wall, but everything about his presence had changed. The isolation that had marked his arrival now transformed into something closer to reverence. Young Marines who had passed him earlier with dismissive glances now approached with respectful nods, their eyes reflecting newfound understanding of what his service truly represented. General Hawthorne's simple gesture had accomplished what no speech or lecture could have achieved. It had bridged the chasm between generations, connecting the sacrifices of yesterday with the responsibilities of today. The salute had served as more than military courtesy. It had become a teaching moment that would resonate through the careers of every Marine who witnessed it. Private Brooks found the courage to approach Ed directly, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine curiosity. "Sir, would you be willing to tell us about your service sometime?" he asked quietly. "I think we have a lot to learn." The request, simple yet profound, represented a complete reversal from the mockery that had characterized the morning's beginning. Ed's response came in the form of a gentle smile, the first anyone had seen from him that day. "Son, the stories belong to all of us," he replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades, but also the warmth of hope renewed. "They're part of who we are as Marines, part of what connects us across time." The conversation that followed drew other young Marines into its orbit, creating an impromptu circle of learning around the memorial wall. Ed spoke not of glory or heroism, but of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, of friendships forged under fire, and of the responsibility each generation bears to honor those who came before while preparing those who will follow. General Hawthorne observed this gathering from a distance, satisfied that his simple act of recognition had sparked something far more valuable than any formal ceremony could have produced. The true measure of military leadership, he knew, lay not in commanding obedience but in inspiring understanding. As the sun climbed higher and the base settled into its daily rhythm, the lessons of that morning began to spread beyond the parade ground. In barracks conversations, during training exercises, and in quiet moments of reflection, the story of the general's salute would be retold and remembered. If you've served, or if someone in your family has worn the uniform, you understand the invisible threads that connect us all to this legacy. Take a moment today to reach out to a former service member in your community. Listen to their stories. Thank them not just for their service, but for their sacrifice. Support organizations that help those who gave everything for our freedom. Share this story if it moved you. Honor those who served by ensuring their sacrifices are never forgotten, because in every salute, in every act of remembrance, we keep alive the values that define us as a nation. The memorial wall stood as it always had, names etched in stone bearing witness to the endless cost of freedom. But now it was no longer just a monument to the past. It had become a bridge to the future, connecting all who serve in an unbroken chain of honor that time could never diminish. True valor, they had all learned, is indeed eternal.